"Sit down, nobody touch her." Mrs. Dana Whitmore's voice cut through the classroom just as a boy in the front row jumped from his chair. I was already on the floor. My presentation papers had scattered beneath the desks, and somewhere above me, chairs scraped and students whispered. I could hear everything. That was the terrifying part. I just couldn't make my body respond. Seconds earlier, I'd been standing beside my desk waiting for my name to be called when my throat started itching. Then came the pressure in my chest. "Mrs. Whitmore," I'd whispered, gripping the desk. "Something's wrong, I can't breathe properly." Her eyes had gone straight to the presentation screen. Convenient timing, Nelly. I reached toward my backpack. I never made it. My knees folded beneath me, and I hit the floor hard enough to send my papers sliding across the tiles. Then I heard my teacher say the words I would never forget. "She's faking it." A few students laughed. I tried to tell them I was. Nothing came out. My name is Nelly Carter. I'm 20 years old, a college sophomore, and I'd spent most of my life trying not to be the person everyone had to stop for. But lying on that classroom floor, I desperately needed someone to stop. "Nelly." A girl's voice came from nearby. "Maya." The laughter disappeared. "Mrs. Whitmore, look at her face." I said stay seated. "No, something's wrong." My throat felt tighter with every breath. I could barely move my fingers. Mrs. Whitmore stood behind her desk instead of coming toward me. She was supposed to present next. Give her a minute. Maya stared at her, then at me. Then she pulled out her phone. "I'm calling 911. Maya." She ignored Mrs. Whitmore and made the call. By the time sirens screamed outside the building, the room had gone completely silent. Footsteps thundered down the hallway. A paramedic burst through the door carrying a medical bag. He dropped beside me, checked my airway, then touched my shoulder. "Nelly, can you hear me?" I couldn't answer. His expression changed instantly. "Get oxygen ready." His partner knelt beside him. The first paramedic looked around the classroom. "How long has she been down?" Nobody spoke. Maya lowered her eyes. A boy near the window looked toward Mrs. Whitmore. The paramedic followed his gaze. Mrs. Whitmore's face had changed. "She just collapsed," she said. "That's not what I asked." He reached for the radio clipped to his uniform. "How long?" Still no answer. And as I lay there struggling for air, one question suddenly mattered more than anything else. What had happened during those missing minutes that made my teacher so afraid to tell him the truth? That morning, I had practiced my presentation 3 times before leaving my dorm. Not because I was unprepared. Because I knew Mrs. Whitmore was waiting for another reason to call me difficult. I had never skipped one of her classes. I turned assignments in early. I sat near the front. But a few weeks earlier, something had changed between us. Halfway through one of her lectures, my throat had started itching. It wasn't severe, but with my history of allergic reactions, I knew ignoring early symptoms could be dangerous. I raised my hand. "Mrs. Whitmore, may I step outside for a minute? My throat feels strange." She stared at me. "Can it wait? I really need to check." She eventually waved me toward the door. After class, she stopped me in the hallway. "Nelly." I turned around. She lowered her voice. "You cannot use your condition every time you're uncomfortable." I froze. "I'm not using it." "Then we understand each other." "The disability office has my emergency information," I said. "They sent it to my instructors." Her expression hardened. "I know how to run my classroom." That conversation stayed with me. So on presentation day, when the first itching started, I tried to ignore it. I told myself to make it through class. That hesitation was why I waited until my chest tightened before telling her something was wrong. And now, minutes later, a paramedic was kneeling over me. "Airway swelling," he said sharply. We need to treat this now. His partner moved immediately, preparing oxygen while the first paramedic administered emergency treatment. Maya, I heard someone say. I know where her bag is. Maya hurried toward my desk, grabbed my backpack and searched it. Here. She pulled out my emergency medication. The paramedic looked at it, then at me. She has a known severe allergy. Maya nodded quickly. Yes, I think so. Mrs. Whitmore stood several feet away. She hadn't said a word. The paramedic looked around. Did anyone here know about her allergy before she collapsed? Silence. Then Maya slowly raised her hand and pointed. Not at another student. At Mrs. Whitmore's desk. I think she did. Every face turned toward our teacher. Beside Mrs. Whitmore's computer sat a folder. I could barely keep my eyes open, but I saw her move. She stepped toward the desk, reached for the folder, and before the paramedic could see what was inside, Mrs. Whitmore snapped it shut. Everybody moved back. The second paramedic cleared space around me while his partner continued treating me. Oxygen covered my face now, and the classroom that had been filled with laughter minutes earlier had become painfully quiet. One of the boys who had laughed was staring at the floor. Then he spoke. I was going to call. Mrs. Whitmore looked at him. Excuse me. When Nelly fell, I got up because I was going to call for help. Another student leaned forward. So was I. Mrs. Whitmore crossed her arms. Everything happened very quickly. No, it didn't, Maya said. The entire room turned toward her. She still had her phone in her hand. You told everyone not to feed into it. Mrs. Whitmore's face tightened. I was trying to determine whether Nelly had actually fainted. She said she couldn't breathe before she fell. I did not realize. Several minutes passed, Maya interrupted. You kept saying she was pretending. The paramedic beside me stopped. He looked up. Several minutes. Mrs. Whitmore answered immediately. It couldn't have been more than a few seconds. Maya shook her head. The paramedic touched his radio. Dispatch, confirm the timestamp on the original emergency call. A response crackled back. Students started pulling out their phones. Someone checked the recording of the presentation session. Another student found the time stamped on a message he had sent moments after I collapsed. The numbers began lining up. And they did not support Mrs. Whitmore. Maya had been right. I had been lying there for minutes before anyone called emergency services. Mrs. Whitmore stepped backward. I genuinely believed she was avoiding the presentation. The paramedic stared at her. She was having difficulty breathing. His partner adjusted the oxygen as they prepared to move me onto the stretcher. Severe allergic reaction, he said into his radio. Patient presented with airway swelling and altered responsiveness. Mrs. Whitmore went still. Then he added something else. Witnesses are reporting a delay before emergency services were contacted. Her face drained of color. The paramedic lowered his radio and looked directly at her. I'm calling this in as a delayed medical response. By the time the ambulance reached the hospital, the emergency treatment had started working. I was stabilizing. Back on campus, Mrs. Whitmore's problems were only beginning. Because the paramedic had documented a delayed medical response, college administrators moved quickly. They preserved the classroom presentation recording, emergency call timestamps, and student statements before memories could blur. Mrs. Whitmore gave administrators a simple explanation. I didn't know Nelly had a potentially life-threatening allergy. For a moment, that mattered. A terrible judgment call was one thing. Ignoring a known emergency was something else entirely. Then Maya spoke. There was a folder. An administrator looked at her. What folder? The one beside Mrs. Whitmore's computer. When the paramedic asked who knew about Nelly's allergy, she closed it. Administrators checked Mrs. Whitmore's semester records. Inside that folder was my accommodation notice. My name was on it. So were the emergency instructions. Throat tightness, difficulty breathing, collapse, reduced responsiveness. Any of those symptoms required immediate emergency action. And there was confirmation that Mrs. Whitmore had received the document. Then administrators checked the disability office records. There was another message. After my earlier throat irritation in class, the disability office had sent Mrs. Whitmore a reminder about my condition and emergency protocol. She hadn't simply received the warning once. She had received it twice. At the hospital, I opened my eyes properly sometime later. My mother was sitting beside me. She reached for my hand. The doctor said the reaction was severe. I stared at the oxygen line beneath my nose. I heard them laughing, Mom. Her fingers tightened around mine. Then she asked the question I couldn't stop thinking about. Did your teacher know? Before I could answer, someone knocked. A college administrator entered carrying a file. She closed the door behind her and walked toward my bed. Nelly, she said quietly, there's something in Mrs. Whitmore's records you need to see. The administrator placed the file on the table beside my hospital bed. My mother stayed beside me as she opened it. This was sent to Mrs. Whitmore at the beginning of the semester. She turned the document toward me. My name was at the top. Underneath it were the emergency instructions I already knew by heart. Throat tightness, difficulty breathing, collapse or reduced responsiveness required immediate action. At the bottom was confirmation that Mrs. Whitmore had received it. My mother stared at the page. So she knew. The administrator nodded. There's more. She pulled out another record. After the earlier incident, when I had asked to leave class because my throat felt strange, the disability office had sent Mrs. Whitmore a second reminder. The exact symptoms she had watched happen that day had been explained to her twice. I looked away. What hurt most wasn't simply knowing she had been wrong. It was remembering the laughter. I could hear them, I whispered. When I was on the floor, I could hear people laughing. My mother squeezed my hand. A few days later, Maya visited me. She stood awkwardly near the door until I told her to come inside. I should have called sooner, she said. You called when everyone else was listening to her. Maya looked down. I almost listened too. But you didn't. That decision mattered. So did what happened next. Maya and several classmates submitted written statements. They confirmed that I had said I couldn't breathe before collapsing. They confirmed Mrs. Whitmore called me a faker. They also confirmed she discouraged students from immediately intervening. The timestamps supported them. So did the emergency call. And so did the paramedic's report. During the investigation, Mrs. Whitmore was confronted with the medical notice bearing confirmation that she had received it. Then investigators placed the second reminder beside it. There was no explanation left. She had decided I was dramatic before I ever hit the floor. And when the exact emergency she had been warned about happened in front of her, that judgment mattered more to her than what she was seeing. Mrs. Whitmore was removed from teaching while the investigation continued. When it concluded, the college found that she had violated emergency response procedures and failed to follow my documented medical plan. Her employment was terminated. But the consequences didn't stop with her. The college reviewed its emergency procedures and required staff to undergo additional training. Faculty were explicitly instructed that personal doubts about a student's symptoms could never justify delaying emergency assistance. My accommodations were strengthened too. When I returned to campus weeks later, my emergency medication remained immediately accessible. And eventually, I walked into a classroom carrying the same presentation I had never finished. Maya sat near the front. I stood beside the screen. For 1 second, I remembered my papers scattering across the floor. Then I started. Slide after slide, I delivered the presentation I had practiced so many times. Nobody laughed. Nobody called me dramatic. When I reached the final slide, I looked around the room and finished without apologizing, explaining myself, or asking anyone's permission to be there. Before my collapse, Mrs. Whitmore's authority had been enough to make an entire classroom doubt what they could see happening in front of them. Afterward, those same students became witnesses. The timestamps became evidence. The medical notices became proof. And the paramedic who looked around that silent classroom and called in the delayed response started the process that finally forced everyone to examine what had happened during those missing minutes. The day I hit that classroom floor, my teacher called me a liar, but the emergency call, the witnesses, and the record made sure I never had to prove the truth alone again.